It's lack of change know-how, 20%, lack of transparency because of missing or wrong information, 10%, another green, lack of motivation of involved employees, 16%, and then the last three, change of process, change of IT systems, and technology barriers, anywhere from 8 to 15%. And if you look back historically at what organizations do when they are engaged in a change process, they tend to focus on the reds, and particularly tend to focus on the ones at the bottom. Change of process, change of IT systems, technology barriers, and so on. And they do that reasonably well. Where we often miss is in the green area, the people stuff. And that's where culture fits in. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. At RHR, we do a good bit of work in a variety of areas, but one of the places that we do work with companies, both portfolio companies and publicly traded companies, is on organizational change. And our observations are very consistent with the IBM study. And here are some of the things that we found. The CEO doesn't stand in front of the change. It's somebody else's job, and doesn't consistently address the need for change. One of the things that we'll talk about is the need to have a story and to be repeating the story over and over and over again until people are sick of it. Secondly, the leadership team doesn't speak with one voice, is not aligned. Some are, some aren't. And it's, the change stuff happens over there. That's not our job. It's somebody else's job. Beyond that, the change efforts are layered on top of day-to-day responsibility. So first we do the change stuff, then we stop that, and then we go on to do what we're there to do. So the change effort is not integrated into the day-to-day activities of the organization. There's always going to be resistance to change. That's a given. The challenge is how you deal with the resistance of change, particularly at lower levels, and often that is not overcome, and therefore some people change and a lot of people don't. We'll talk later on the panel, I think, on communications and the importance of communications throughout the process. And also, lastly, the change efforts are too narrow. We focus on a couple of levers, or we focus on change in a couple of areas, and we ignore or don't focus on some of the other things that will either support, expand, or drive the change. So I'm going to take some time now and take each of these and talk about some ways that you can deal with them and address them and hopefully be one of the 25 to 50% of successful change efforts. Step one, and this is just basic good project management, is to define and assess. Define first, what does good look like? What is the to-be state in behavioral terms? And I'll give you an example in a minute. The next slide does that. Next is, once we know what good looks like, what do we got? So typical gap analysis. The current state and what are our key gaps? What are the deltas? Next is the tricky part. In most cases, some things need to change a lot, some things a little, and some things you can keep intact. And so where are you in terms of those three parameters? So you're going to make the decisions around what needs to change and what can stay the same. And fourth, culture change is typically part of a broader transformational effort involving several factors, and we'll go over those as well. Most CEOs, particularly incumbents, have difficulty dismantling what they built. Right? Smiles around the room. And often underestimate what it'll take. founder CEOs have been, the successful ones, have been successful frequently by dint of their own brilliance and their own drive. That just doesn't work in a lot of settings when you're changing culture, even if they want to do it, which they frequently don't. And I would suggest that operating partners, many of you in this room, can play a really, really important role in providing guidance to those CEOs and also to your colleagues in the private equity firms around that. Helping CEOs reality test what really needs to be done. This really isn't working, even though it's one of your sacred cows. Provide the voice of experience of someone who's been there. And also identify outside resources at the times that those make sense, and also indicate where it doesn't make sense, so that dollars are spent in an appropriate way. So let me give you an example, and I know this is hard to read, so I'll help you, of the first step, which is to define the to-be state in behavioral terms. In this example, there was a strong need to execute for maximum scalable impact. This was a company that had cleaned up its balance sheet and now wanted to grow. And at the same time, didn't want to switch back to spending money inappropriately, wanted to keep the cost control. So grow and at least maintain the cost structure that they had. And their rationale for that, or one of the things that they wanted to do, is change their organizational structure. And one of the first things that many of us do when we create change is change the structure and hope that that's going to be doing it. And in this particular case, this company was divided up into siloed business units, and they wanted to switch over to a matrixed environment where resources are shared, where there's opportunities for cross-selling, and also where processes and systems are more consistent. So that's what they wanted to do. One of the things that they quickly realized was that that wasn't going to work if the top team really didn't get on board. And so with our help, they defined what are the behaviors that needed to be exhibited by the top team that would demonstrate that they not only were on board, but they were driving the change. And they identified 4 behaviors. Make decisions for the good of the overall enterprise, even at the expense of one's own piece of the business. So for the good of the team versus the good of my team. Confidently sponsor and or lead large-scale projects requiring cross-functional teamwork. So there's a project leadership or sponsorship responsibility, but it was cross-functional. So I didn't own all the people and I didn't own all the resources. Comfortable leading without positional authority, one of the key elements of a matrixed environment. But still, it's not we all sit around the table and talk, we get things done. So instill a sense of urgency and intensity driving the decision-making process and the results. One of the risks in setting up a matrix, as you know, is there's a lot of meetings and sometimes that doesn't lead to action. So they wanted to make sure that that was put in. These statements are part of a larger document that we call the winning formula. And what they are for either an individual position or, in this case, a group of positions, define the organizational imperatives and then talk about the specific behaviors that demonstrate what good looks like in behavioral terms wherever possible. So we've defined what good looks like. Now we have to do our assessment of what do we got? What's going on within the organization? What's the culture? What's the operating system? How do things work? And there's a variety of different things that you can do. The obvious one is to observe and ask. Do your walking around, whether you're doing your due diligence or you're at a board meeting or you're talking to people or so on. It's really helpful when you're doing that for particular purposes of culture change to really understand, at least up front, what good looks like, so that your observations and your asking are pointed to the specific things that you're looking for, stating the obvious. For larger organizations, or where something more formal is appropriate, you can do interviews and focus groups. Frequently, outside resources are helpful for this, so that there's some independence and also someone who is skilled at doing that. And you can take diagonal slices, you can do focus groups, you can interview people, and so on and so forth. We talked about the importance of top leadership, and here many of you do assessments for CEOs and CFOs for selection, but you can also do them for culture change and for development, and they can be very, very appropriate and can be something that the top team will embrace as a positive thing rather than as a witch hunt. It's important how you stage it, but my experience is that most of the time the senior team embraces the idea that this is actually something that's going to help them. You can do a bunch of surveys, a senior team effectiveness survey, which talks about the effectiveness of the senior team as a team as opposed to individuals, which the individual assessments will do. Organizational effectiveness surveys, so you can get top to bottom and diagonal slices and so on. Evaluation checklists of key processes. How is it working, red, yellow, green? And then also, if you want to look in larger organizations below the senior team, look at one level or two levels below the CEO and the senior team and survey top leadership, top 25. There's one that's a larger organization that does that fairly regularly for the top 120 people in the company. So those are some different ways that you can figure out what's going on. And I would suggest that the easiest and most appropriate place to start is with your nose when you're walking around and you're talking to people. So we've done our determination of what good looks like. We've assessed the current state, and now it's obviously time to build the action plan. And the first obvious question is, what are we going to target? What are the key needs? And the sensing process is something that we're all familiar with around, gee, we can't change everything. We really don't want to change everything. But the art, again, is what are we going to change, what are we going to tweak, and what are we going to leave the same? Change is always disruptive. By definition, change is disruptive. So being selective about what's going to change and what isn't going to change is very, very important to avoid the unnecessary disruption that you then have to deal with. Second, leadership has to articulate a need for change. What's the story? The story is not just we need to change, and it's not just a couple of things that are financially oriented. It tells the story in a compelling way that gets repeated by the CEO and by senior leadership over and over again. And every piece of the change effort is linked back to the story. The reason why we're doing this is because whatever our story is, or this is going to fit into where we want to get to as a company, which is XYZ. So crafting the story in emotional as well as intellectual words is very, very important, so people can feel passion about the change as well as it makes sense to me. And we talked about the other levers. What are the other levers that we're going to change to create the critical mass? And some of those levers are, and this is not an exclusive list, organizational structure. We're going to go from siloed business units to matrix. Work processes, again, formal and informal. Organizational resources, who gets what? Talent, not only at the top, but throughout the organization. Goals and reward systems. Very often we change everything but our comp structure. And our comp structure continues to reinforce the old behaviors. Big problem. Big problem. And then facilities and locations and architecture. I'm working now with an organization that is headquartered in a beautiful townhouse in Georgetown, in D.C. And they, fortunately, they own the building free and clear because they brought in a new CEO, and one of the first things that she saw was every department is on a different floor in this townhouse. The architecture encourages people to stay within their own floor and within their own department. And she wants to create lots of free-flowing conversation because of what needs to happen with this organization that is going through some very significant change. And so the architecture of the building gets in the way. And if they can't figure that out through doing some major renovations of the building, their plan is to sell it and buy something that architecturally fits more into where they want to get to as a culture. I just use that as an example of some of the things that we can think about that are not necessarily obvious. So we've got our plan. We know what we want to change. We know what we want to keep the same. And I would suggest that there are 4 primary levers to the change process. And they are the CEO, the top team, the change process, and also measuring results. And we'll go through each of those